then everybody, so we're going to look at three different ways we can start our story. So we've got once upon a time, the crowd held their breath, and it was a normal day in the city of Alsdale, my made up city. So which one of these do you think is the most effective way of starting a story? Well, of course, the second one is the most effective way. Once upon a time is boring, we always hear it. And the third one's okay, but it could be better. But the second one's the best because it throws the reader straight into the action. So try and do that when you start your story. These are three different ways we have of starting a story. We could start a story by using direct speech between the characters. "Watch out," Mr. C wailed to the gathering crowd below. "Today is the perfect day to get the plan started," Mr. G said to himself. "Today is the day we destroy the world." So we can start our story by using direct speech. We could also start our story by throwing the reader straight into the action, like we said in our last slide. The crowd below all held their breath. Silence descended in the centre of Alsdale City. His heart was thumping out of his chest. He felt pressure like never before. Could this be the first mission he ever failed? So you can throw your reader straight into the action, get your reader excited. So that's another way we could start our story. And then our final way is to actually begin at the end of the story. You've probably never heard of the tale of Mr. C and Mr. G. My name is Johnny, and I'm going to tell you everything that happened on that awful day. Now that's going to make the reader want to read on to find out what actually happened. So we're going to start my idea of a story by using my introduction from my story plan with throwing the reader right into the action. The crowd all held their breath. Dozens of Alsdale citizens stood with their faces pointing to the sky, hoping, praying for Mr. C to arrive. Now notice how I've got a blue box at the top. This is going to be all of my wow vocabulary that I'm going to try and include during my introduction. So I've started off with my really exciting intro and throwing the reader right into the action. The crowd all held their breath. Dozens of Alsdale citizens stood with their faces pointing to the sky, hoping, praying for Mr. C to arrive. Helpless, a small tabby cat was clinging from the tallest branch in the middle of the city square. This had attracted more attention than anyone would have thought. Suddenly, a flash of light beamed from above. What came next was followed by a triumph of cheers from the concerned crowd. The local hero, Mr. C, had arrived to save the day. So let's look at some of the features then. The crowd all held their breath. This is me starting my story right in the action, getting the reader hooked into the story. I've also got hoping, praying, two verbs separated by a comma for effect. Nice snappy words there, separated with a comma. Started the sentence with helpless, a fronted adverbial. Helpless, a small tabby cat was clinging from the tallest branch, quite excited. Another fronted adverbial. Suddenly, a flash of light beamed from above. So here are some of the features from that first opening section. And then I've used parenthesis at the bottom, the local hero, Mr. C. So maybe you could use some of these too. Next part. Some moments later, the tabby cat was safely back to the ground, and Mr. C was humbly accepting the applause and recognition. There was one member of the crowd in particular who stood in awe of Mr. C. His name was Johnny. Johnny was a 10-year-old boy who had bright blonde hair and was wearing a Mr. C t-shirt. He was the first to arrive at the scene, and was normally the first to arrive at any disaster to eagerly await the arrival of his hero. So let's look at some features from this second part of our introduction. I've started the new paragraph with a fronted adverbial, some moments later, to link the paragraphs together. I've also used safely and humbly, rather than just saying the tabby cat was back to the ground and Mr. C was accepting. I've used safely and humbly to add more information. I've used a relative clause here. The crowd in particular who stood in awe of Mr. C. Awe is a really nice word to describe how someone is showing their emotion towards something. If they're standing in awe, they're amazed. I've used another relative clause to add detail and description about Johnny, who's such a key part of my story. So make sure in your story you go into lots of detail. I did notice as I was reading out that I used is instead of was. Make sure your story always has the same tense. Don't mix between present tense is and past tense was. I've also used another adverb at the bottom for eagerly. Okay, next part of the introduction. The breathtaking sight of Johnny's hero was enough to put a smile on his face. Mr. C was the strongest and most powerful being Johnny had ever seen. He wore a bright red superhero outfit which had a small blue triangle in the middle. The triangle had Mr. C engraved with a small blue gem underneath the C. Johnny always believed that this is what gave him his power. However, as Mr. C slowly made his way towards Johnny, the ground started to quake. "A disturbance!" Mr. C exclaimed. "Everybody, down!" So let's look at these features too. I've used breathtaking, a really nice compound adjective which you could easily use in a superhero story. Breathtaking. Strongest and most powerful, these are superlative adjectives. They're used to show real just how powerful this superhero is. I've gone into lots of detailed description about what the superhero looks like so my reader can imagine it. And I've also here got the reader thinking. Johnny always believed that this small blue gem is what gave Mr. C his power, and that's going to be really important at the end of my story. I'm starting to give the reader some clues, so I'm starting to use what I'm saying to get the reader guessing. And at the end, I've used show not tell to show just how worried Mr. C is. A disturbance, everybody down. And then the end part of my introduction. Another flash of light appeared in the sky, but this one was dark, evil. It was a dark, evil red colour. Screams could be heard from blocks away. Johnny already knew what was coming, or more like who was coming. Mr. G, Mr. C's arch rival. The barbaric supervillain descended from the sky and landed with a fierce thud on the ground. "Your time is up, you foul beings," an evil voice sneered. "I'll be destroying the city and there is nothing you can do to stop me." He pointed a long evil finger at Mr. C. Mr. G wore a very similar costume to Mr. G, but his was entirely in black. He had black spiky hair and a long beard, which looked like it had never been washed. Before Johnny could run for cover, Mr. G clicked his fingers and Johnny had been snapped up by the roots ascending from the ground. "Mr. C, if you want to save this boy in this city, meet me in my home and sacrifice your power." After a horrifying laugh, the threatening Mr. G shot into the sky and was gone. So what are the features of this longer part of my introduction, the conclusion of my introduction? So I've contrasted the outfits between Mr. C and Mr. G. Sorry, not the outfits, the light. It was a dark, evil red light colour. I've then used show not tell. Screams could be heard from miles away. Shows just how scary this thing is. I've used there or more like who was coming to build the atmosphere. Johnny already knew what was coming, or more like who was coming, getting the reader guessing. The barbaric supervillain, 2 words you can take straight into your own superhero story, barbaric and supervillain. I've also used, which is a really important part of writing stories, speech to convey character. I've made sure that what my evil character, Mr. G, says conveys his character, shows he's evil. And I also noticed that I spelt destroying wrong. I also as well noticed that I put Mr. G twice instead of Mr. G and Mr. C. Maybe I need to get better at using an iPad. But again, I've gone into lots of detailed description about what he looks like so the reader can imagine it. Black spiky hair, black suit, black superhero costume, shows just how evil he is. And after a horrifying laugh, the threatening Mr. G shot into the sky and was gone. So there's my conclusion. My conclusion to my introduction. So here's my story then. The crowd all held their breath. Dozens of Aylesdale citizens stood with their faces pointing to the sky. So I've used a fronted adverbial to start my story. And it's showing just how amazing Mr. C is. They're all waiting for Mr. C to arrive. It makes the reader excited to see Mr. C arrive. We then got helpless and suddenly, really effective sentence starters. One thing we can't have is you just starting your sentences with the and it all the time, or your reader's going to get bored. Again, I've linked my paragraph in the second section some moments later. I've made sure that I've not just started the tabby cat was, I've linked my paragraphs together. I've gone into detailed description about who Johnny is. He's such an important part of my story. I've used relative clauses to do that. Who had bright blonde hair and was wearing a Mr. C t-shirt. I've then used a really effective opener here. The breathtaking sight of Johnny's hero was enough to put a smile on his face. It goes to show just how amazing Mr. C, this superhero, is. I've used strongest and most powerful to describe him. I've gone into detailed description about what he looks like. I've started to make the reader guess about the blue gem underneath the C of his emblem in the middle. And then I've used show, not tell at the bottom, and speech to convey Mr. C's character. I've compared and contrasted the colour of the light of Mr. G and Mr. C. It was a dark, evil red colour, so you instantly know as a reader that this character is a bad one. Screams could be heard from blocks away, show, not tell, to show just how worrying this time is for the story. Barbaric supervillain, 2 words you can use in your story, really effective words to describe the supervillain. Sneered, that's a better word for said, isn't it? Sneered, and conveys the character of the evil Mr. G. Entirely in black, think about the use of colours and how that can really portray a character. If they're in black, are they a really evil character? If they're in a nice light colour, are they a friendly character? Before Johnny could run for cover, there's an effective opener, rather than just saying Mr. G clicked his fingers. So when you write your introduction, these are the things that I'm going to want to be seeing. I want you to pick a really exciting story opener. Don't just start your story opener with your story with once upon a time. Don't just start your story with using something like on a dark day in a city. Could you use speech? Start your story with direct speech, something that's happening. Could you throw your reader right into the middle of the action? Or could you start at the end and have a conversation between characters reflecting on what's happening? The other thing that I'd really like you to think about is how you can build tension and atmosphere when you're writing your introduction, creating atmosphere. Don't just write a story as quickly as you can in the introduction to a story in 10 minutes as quickly as you can. Go into lots of detailed description, build an atmosphere, make the reader want to move on, to read on. When I read your story, I want it to stand out. And also make sure you go into lots of detailed description about the character. You want your reader to be able to imagine the main characters in their heads. I hope you have a good time, folks. I can't wait to see them.